All right, hello. We're back with Chapter 15, Part 3. And talking about the differences against states, one of the interesting things, the Easterlin paradox looks at this idea of different incomes, right? And income and how it is different in a state. And what it says is this, is that when you look at income, right, once everyone has their basic needs met, so once you make enough money to comfortably feed yourself, take care of yourself, have a house, have the clothes that you want to wear. Once those basic needs are met, right, it doesn't really make you as happy the richer you get. In other words, if you go from $10,000 a year and barely getting by and living in poverty, and go to $100,000 a year, where you are living a very comfortable life at $100,000 a year, maybe your happiness goes up by 90%, right? But if you go from $100,000 a year to $1 million a year, well, that's not wrong. Don't get me wrong. That would be nice, but you're not going to be another 90% happier in a sense because you've already got everything you need. So, in other words, you already have a house. Does a second house make you twice as happy? Does a third house make you three times as happy? If you have three cars and you buy three more, does that make you three times happier? In other words, once you get to that basic level, happiness does increase, but not as dramatically, right? So think about this. If I all gave you a house right now, that would all make you very, very happy. But would giving you four houses make you four times as happy? Maybe not. And we actually find that in measurements in a lot of situations. And a good example is Denmark versus the United States. So in Denmark, the average income in Denmark isn't much higher. In fact, it's a little bit lower than the United States. But they usually score much more happier in their life. And one of the reasons is in Denmark, as part of the government, you pay a lot in taxes. That is true. But in Denmark, your education is completely free all the way through college. And where you're going to college, you are also given housing allowance and you're given money to study so that you can study and then have money to live. You don't have to have a job while you're in school. Not only that, your medical care from the time you're born to the day you die is completely free. So education is free, medical care is free. You are entitled to a certain level of housing so that if something happens and you lose your job, you'll not be out on the streets. It may not be perfect housing, but it's not living, in a shelter. So housing, education, all these things are included. So in other words, they don't make as much money than we do on average, but that's also because a lot of their basic needs are met. It doesn't mean that they're less happy. Okay, their quality of life is still quite high. So one prospective idea is maybe we should measure gross national happiness, because in our country, even though we make on average more than many countries, a lot of countries, pay for health insurance, and here that's not a given. So if you are sick or ill, or if you lose a job and lose your health insurance, it's a much different hit than it is in other countries. In a lot of countries, housing is considered a right. So public housing in Europe does not have the same social stigma it does here. It's by no means, luxurious living, but you are guaranteed a basic place to live if something was to happen. And again, in a lot of countries, education is subsidized. So those things tend to be much happier. The country of Bhutan is actually one of the poorest countries in the world. Most of the society are still very rural, small family farms. But because on a family farm you can grow your own food, you can pretty much supply much of your needs without cash, even though they make far less than what we do and would live on what we consider a poverty income. They don't need that much money because they live on their own farms. They usually rate their standard of living to be very, very comfortable and much more happier than we are. And then when it comes to states and countries, we tend to see these as permanent. The United States will always be here. But that's not the case. States are like anything human. They can be strong, but they can be weak, and they can fail. Within the last 50 years, several countries have disappeared. The Soviet Union was the world's largest country by area. In 1991, it collapsed and broke into 8 or 9 different countries, depending on how you count it. So this can happen. And these are what we call the crises of the state. What are the things that would cause a state to fall apart? And it's very similar to what we talked about with empires. So, first one is a fiscal crisis. If a state or a country has to spend more money on things like healthcare or education or military, if it has to spend more than it gets from taxes or revenues, well, think about it. What happens if you spend more money than you make? You go bankrupt or you go back living with your parents. Well, a state can't really move in with mom and dad, so there's an issue. You see tax flaws. Maybe the taxes are written in a way that it doesn't capture all the money available, or it favors certain people. In some countries, the wealthy pay very little tax, right? Or it leads to a shadow economy, the black market, people working under the table. A legitimization crisis is when a state loses the appeal of those it governs and therefore can't govern it. So if a country is consistently making bad decisions and maybe is leading to a fiscal crisis, if the people who live there have had enough, they have a revolution and the state disappears. Think about this. This is a weird thought, right? Why do we have a country called the United States? Right? Most of us who live here in some way or another allow the government to happen. If everyone in the United States said that we no longer want to be the United States, if they got up and said we're not going to pay any taxes, if every single person did it, there'd be no way for the government to stop it, right? I don't think that'll happen. But if enough people do, that's when you have a revolution. If enough people challenge the legitimacy of a state, and that has happened several times, if the government doesn't change, the country very well might. And that's very similar to a rationality crisis. And a rationality crisis is when a state continues to make bad decisions that allow other crises to emerge. So a rationality crisis could lead to a fiscal crisis, which could lead to a legitimization crisis. They all kind of tie together. So the spatial nature, a state, what makes it a state? The fact that it governs itself. It has a monopoly of control. So what makes the United States, within our borders, the United States, the fact that no one else has power. So if you go to Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan, it's on the St. Mary's River. One side is Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. You cross the river, you're in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. So Canadian police do not have authority in the United States. Canada has no authority. So this idea of the monopoly of power. The United States cannot send its police or its army into Canada to enforce laws. If it did, without the agreement of Canada, that'd be war, right? So only a state has the ability to use force or make laws with its own territory. So I'm holding this weird face. Sorry, I thought I paused that. But countries that are usually large by one or the other are not. So Bangladesh and Pakistan are very large. Nigeria by population, but not by area. So not as powerful as the other ones. Whereas Canada, large by area, not by population. So usually when you have both, it gives you some advantages. And again, the top five are both. And also in this group are the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And these are expected to be the next level of superpowers in the next 50 years. They are both large in area and growing population. So there's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So then, does size really matter about states? Well, if you have a lot of area, if you have a lot of square miles, there's the potential for a lot of resources. So, for instance, the United States covers most of North America. And within that large area, we have several natural resources like oil and metals. We have a lot of area to grow crops. So you have that. It doesn't always a guarantee. Some countries are very large in Egypt, in Africa, in Asia, that have a lot of area that is desert. But for the most part, if you have a large country, you have more resources, which can also help feed a larger population. Now, another thing that can happen is some countries maybe don't have that. They don't have a large size or a large population. But what they can do is they can basically join with their neighbors and expand their territory with economic unions. So in the European Union, the EU in Europe, for instance, the country of Belgium is about the size of the state of Illinois, very small in size. But because it has joined forces with countries like Germany and France and the Netherlands and Norway and Italy, they have basically formed an economic area the size of Europe. So it gives them kind of that extra reach. Okay. Another thing is the location of states. So states that are in red here in this map are landlocked. And what that means is there is no direct way for them to access the oceans. So they don't have any ports of their own on the oceans, which can make trade quite difficult. In fact, Bolivia here in South America has a large amount of tin, a very valuable metal, but in order for them to trade, they have to ship it through either Peru or Brazil or Chile to ship it around the world, which makes them quite vulnerable. It's hard to control your own trade when you have to allow other countries to take care of it. And so most of these countries that are landlocked tend to be among some of the poorest in the world. Ironically, there are a few exceptions. Here in Europe, Switzerland is landlocked as well. They were able to overcome that through other methods. They focused on economic unions and economic treaties with other countries in Europe and kind of overcame that. Okay. Now, another thing about states is if you are located in an area that doesn't have much in the way of resources, that's going to be a negative thing. If your state is located where there's really no metals to mine or oil to drill and you really can't grow too many crops, then it's going to have an issue. Okay. So they call this also, by the way, another way of looking at this is the Dutch disease and the resource curse. You could have too much of a good thing. So right now, our economy in this world is based on oil, right? We use a lot of oil. And so you would think that having a lot of oil would give countries a lot of power. And in fact, Russia gets a lot of its might and a lot of its power from the fact that it is a large oil producer. Saudi Arabia does as well. But Nigeria and Venezuela are two of the largest countries with oil. And yet, Venezuela and Nigeria are basically descending into chaos and might even fail as states. And they call it the resource curse. If you have so much of one resource that it dominates your economy, it's very easy for the government to become corrupt and exploit that to maintain its power. And when that happens, we tend to see governments that are very authoritarian and do not do much to make the everyday citizen's life better. And one of the ways they do that is because there is so much money they get from this oil that they sell that they basically can either beef up their police to keep the country in control, or they can do social programs like Saudi Arabia, for instance, where they may not have much political freedom in Saudi Arabia, but the people lead a very comfortable life, and there are some trade offs to that. Spatial nature of the state can also tie into this national environmental ideologies. And we kind of talked about this, right? That the identity of a state is bound with its physical territory, right? So we think about the United States, right, and the idea of the Wild West, but also in the United States we have this idea of the rugged individual, right? That all you need to do in this country is if you do the best you can do, if you go to school and work hard, anybody can be president, right? That's this idea of the rugged individual. That, and it goes back to this idea of people who were coming to this country in the 1800s and moved west to settle, and they would work hard and build their own farm and could eventually become powerful, and anybody could be president, right? And that's a national ideology. The West is pure. It's where people go to make their way versus, right, those who live in the big city, right? The city is decaying. The countryside, the West is pure, but the cities, New York, Chicago, uh, the West East Coast, are violent and corrupt. And that's an imagery that we see to this day. Think about the last presidential election. President Trump got most of his support from the rural West and these suburban areas where most major cities did not support him. And there is kind of that distance between the two. I'm going to pause this one right here. We'll come back with the next part in just a moment.